Let me tell you something before we even get into this story. Something that I think about a lot when I look at how we remember people. How we label them. How we take one slice of a person, one moment, one expression, one bad day at the track, and we turn it into the whole story. We slap a name on it, and that name follows them forever, and nobody ever stops to ask if the name was even accurate. Because here's the thing about nicknames. Nicknames don't come from truth. Nicknames come from perception. From the outside looking in. From people who see the surface of you and decide they've seen enough. And in the world of 1970s drag racing, a world that was loud and theatrical and absolutely overflowing with personality, one man stood at the center of all that noise and gave the crowd absolutely nothing. No wave, no smile, no celebration, no performance. Just a stocky guy in a plain shirt standing next to his car with his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere else entirely. Like he was already thinking about the next run before the current one was even finished. Like the roar of the crowd was white noise to him. Like the only conversation worth having was the one happening between him and that engine. His competitors looked at him and didn't know what to do. His fans looked at him and felt vaguely uncomfortable. And the racing world, because it needed something to call him, because it couldn't just leave a man unlabeled in a sport full of legends with legendary names, the racing world called him Grumpy. And that nickname spread. It got into the newspapers and the race programs and the conversations in the grandstands. It became shorthand for a whole personality. A whole type. The difficult one. The antisocial one. The guy you maybe didn't want to be around but you had to respect because the car was always impossibly fast. But here is what I need you to sit with for the next 15 minutes. What if the nickname was wrong? Not partially wrong. Not misleading. What if it was fundamentally, completely, embarrassingly wrong, and we've been repeating it for 50 years without stopping to check? Because I went deep on Bill Jenkins. Deeper than the race results and the championship counts and the surface-level stuff you find in a 5-minute search. I went into the interviews. The accounts from people who worked alongside him. The technical legacy he left behind. The way people who actually knew him, not people who watched from the grandstands, but people who were in his world, the way those people talk about him when nobody's performing for a camera. And what I found changed how I think about this man completely. Because the Bill Jenkins I found wasn't grumpy at all. The Bill Jenkins I found was something this sport has almost never produced before or since. He was a genius. A genuine, rare, once-in-a-generation engineering genius who happened to express that genius through a Chevrolet engine and a quarter-mile of asphalt. A man so focused, so deeply committed to excellence, so fundamentally uninterested in anything that wasn't directly connected to making that car faster, that the world around him mistook his intensity for hostility. They saw crossed arms and thought difficult. They should have seen crossed arms and thought calculating. There is a profound difference. And this video is going to show you exactly what that difference looks like, through the life, the work, and the almost criminally underappreciated legacy of Bill Jenkins. So stay with me, because this story is one of the best ones drag racing has ever produced. And almost nobody is telling it right. The nickname, where it really came from. Alright, let's start at the beginning. Because before we can understand the man, we have to understand the myth. And the myth starts with one word, grumpy. So let's actually pull that word apart and look at what's inside it. Think about the great drag racing nicknames for a second. Really think about them. The Snake. That's Don Prudhomme. Dangerous. Quick. Cold-blooded. You hear that name and you feel something in your chest. Big Daddy. That's Don Garlits. Authority. History. A man who commands a room just by existing in it. The Mongoose. Tom McEwen. Always chasing the snake, always in the hunt, always exciting. These are mythological names. Names that were chosen or earned or carefully cultivated to create an image. Names that told you something about the person, or at least something about who they wanted you to think they were. And then there's Grumpy. Grumpy doesn't tell you about power. It doesn't tell you about speed or danger or legacy. Grumpy tells you about a mood, about a disposition, about how someone made the people around them feel. It's not a name that a man chooses for himself. Nobody sits down and says, you know what would be a great racing persona? Grumpy. That name gets assigned. By people on the outside. By people who encountered something they couldn't categorize and landed on the easiest possible explanation. The story of how it started is both simple and completely revealing about the culture Jenkins was operating in. He's coming up through the regional circuit in Pennsylvania in the early days of his career. Already different. already operating at a level of focus and technical seriousness that set him apart from the guys around him. And the culture of regional drag racing in that era, let me paint this picture for you, was intensely social. These were tight-knit communities. The same guys showing up at the same tracks weekend after weekend. Friendships being built. Rivalries being built. A whole social ecosystem forming around the racing itself. And into that ecosystem walked Bill Jenkins, who had basically zero interest in the social part. You'd try to strike up a conversation with him in the pits and you'd get one of two things. Either a brief, functional response that answered your question and absolutely nothing more. No follow-up, no small talk, no reciprocation of the conversational energy you'd brought. Or you'd get the look. People who knew Jenkins talk about the look like it was a weather event. A specific expression, not angry, not contemptuous exactly, but something close to pure impatience, that appeared on his face when something was interrupting the current of thought running through his head. When you'd asked a question he considered either irrelevant or obvious. When you'd pulled him out of the mental space he was living in and he couldn't quite hide the cost of that interruption. To a lot of people, that look felt like rudeness. And look, I'm not going to completely defend it. In a social setting, in a community of people trying to build relationships, walking around in a permanent bubble of focused intensity and letting it show on your face when that bubble got broken, that's going to create friction. That's just reality. But here's what nobody was asking in those moments. What was he thinking about when you interrupted him? What was running through his head? What problem was he turning over? What calculation was he running? What detail of engine geometry or cam timing or fuel delivery was he working through in his mind? Right up until the moment you walked over to ask him what he thought about the weather. Nobody asked that. Nobody looked at the look and thought, what's on the other side of that expression? They just said he was grumpy. They told their friends. And the name spread, the way things spread in tight-knit communities, fast, and without much scrutiny. What kills me about this, what really gets under my skin when I think about it, is what happened after. Jenkins never fought it. Never corrected anyone. Never gave an interview where he tried to reframe the narrative or present a softer image. Never hired anyone to manage how he was perceived. He just kept working. And that response, or that non-response, tells you everything about his hierarchy of values. At the very top, the work, the engineering, the pursuit of speed through knowledge and precision and relentless refinement. Somewhere much, much further down the list, what you thought of him while he was doing it. That's not grumpy. That's perspective. A rare and genuinely admirable kind of perspective that most of us spend our whole lives trying to develop and never quite get there. Bill Jenkins had it naturally. And the world called it a personality flaw. Now I need you to really feel the environment that Bill Jenkins was operating in. Not just understand it intellectually, feel it. Because without that, the rest of this story loses half its power. Close your eyes for a second and imagine it. Actually, don't close your eyes because you're watching a video, but you know what I mean. Really try to place yourself there. It's the early to mid-1970s. American drag racing is in what historians of the sport will call its golden age. The NHRA is growing faster than anyone expected. Television is starting to pay attention in a serious way. Corporate sponsors, real money, not just local dealership money, are starting to write serious checks to teams that can deliver audiences. And the drivers who figured out how to work that system, who understood that they weren't just racers anymore, they were entertainers. Those drivers were transcending the sport. Don Prudhomme is the perfect example of this. The Snake was as media-savvy as any athlete of his era. Not in a calculated, fake way, in a genuinely magnetic way. He had charisma that came through even on a grainy television broadcast. He was quotable. He was photogenic. He could break down a race in plain language that made casual viewers feel smart for understanding it. He was, by every measure, a modern professional athlete before that template even fully existed. And the Snake versus Mongoose rivalry with Tom McEwen? That was something else entirely. These two men, these two friends and rivals, built a narrative around their competition that was so compelling, so perfectly structured as a sporting drama, that it attracted attention from audiences who had never watched drag racing before and might never watch it again. They got the Hot Wheels deal. They got the mainstream media. They got famous. Not just drag racing famous. Then there's Shirley Muldowney, who I could do an entire separate video about and probably will someday. A woman competing at the absolute highest level of a sport that had made it abundantly clear she wasn't welcome. Facing resistance and hostility and condescension at every turn, and meeting all of it with a combination of raw talent and pure stubborn fire that is honestly one of the most compelling stories in American sports history, Full stop. These people were personalities. In the best possible sense. They were human beings whose inner lives were big enough and vivid enough to come through the camera and grab you by the collar. And they were racing in a world that increasingly rewarded that. A world where being fast was necessary but not sufficient. Where you had to be fast and interesting. Fast and marketable. Fast and willing to play the game. Bill Jenkins was racing in that exact same world. And he was playing a completely different game. His operation was based in Quakertown, Pennsylvania, not exactly the glamour capital of professional motorsport. And the operation itself reflected his priorities with almost brutal honesty. No polish. No image making. No effort to package what was happening there in a way that would be easier for the outside world to consume. Just a shop. Just work. Just the relentless, grinding, obsessive pursuit of performance through engineering. He drove a Chevrolet. Always a Chevrolet. Specifically, he was devoted to the small block Chevy engine the way certain men are devoted to a craft that has consumed them entirely, with the focused love of someone who has looked deeply into something and seen how much more there is to understand. He wasn't loyal to the brand. He was loyal to the engine. To what he knew that engine was capable of in the hands of someone who truly understood it. And here is what people who weren't paying close attention missed about pro stock during this era. It was a class where intelligence was the primary weapon. Not the only weapon. You needed the budget, the equipment, the driving skill. But those things were table stakes. The guys at the top all had them. What separated the great ones from the very good ones was the ability to solve problems that nobody had solved before. To find speed that nobody had found before. To look at an engine or a chassis or a tuning challenge and see something that everyone else was missing. In that environment, Bill Jenkins should have been completely dominant. And for long stretches of his career, he was. The tragedy is that the era he was competing in was simultaneously the best possible era for someone with his gifts, because the engineering challenges were real and the margins were real and raw intelligence actually mattered, and the worst possible era for someone with his temperament, because the sport was becoming a media product and the media wanted characters, not craftsmen. He was the right man in the right sport at the slightly wrong cultural moment. And somehow, impossibly, he still won. The engineer. This is what nobody talks about. This is the section. If you've been half watching up to this point, and I get it, life is busy, there are distractions, I need you to fully arrive right now. Because what I'm about to tell you about Bill Jenkins is the part of his story that almost never gets properly explained. And it's the part that makes everything else make sense. It's the part that explains why a man with no interest in being famous became someone that serious people in this sport still talk about in reverent tones. Let me put you inside a drag racing team operation in the early 1970s. Not a big factory-backed team with unlimited resources. A real team. A team like Jenkins was running. There are no computers. No data logging systems feeding real-time information to a laptop screen. No sophisticated telemetry. No team of engineers back at headquarters running simulations. Nothing like that exists yet in this world. If you want to know why your car ran a particular elapsed time, why it ran a 9.9 instead of a 9.8, or a 9.7 instead of a 9.6, you have to figure it out yourself. With your eyes. With your instruments. With your hands. With whatever you've built inside your own head over years and years of learning and experimenting and being wrong and figuring out why you were wrong. Most teams in that era were working on what you might charitably call advanced intuition. They had experienced people who had seen a lot and learned a lot and had good instincts about what to try next. That was genuinely valuable. That won races. But Bill Jenkins was doing something categorically different. Jenkins wasn't running on intuition. Jenkins was running on understanding. There's a gulf between those two things that most people never fully cross in any discipline. Intuition says, try this, I think it'll work. Understanding says, try this, here's exactly why it'll work, here's the mechanism by which it will produce the result, here's how much improvement we should expect and in what range. He wanted to know why. Not just what worked, why it worked. Not just which cam profile made the engine run faster. Why that profile, what was it doing to the valve events, how was that interacting with the cylinder head flow characteristics, what was the net effect on cylinder filling at the RPM range he was operating in. This is engineering thinking. Real engineering thinking. The kind that universities spend years trying to develop in students. And Jenkins had developed it largely on his own, through obsessive self-education and the kind of hands-on experimentation that turns theoretical knowledge into genuine expertise. His mastery of the small block Chevrolet engine became almost legendary in the racing community. And I use the word mastery deliberately because this wasn't familiarity and it wasn't expertise in the normal sense of the word. This was the kind of deep, comprehensive, intuitive and analytical at the same time knowledge that you only develop when you've given something thousands of hours and brought your full intelligence to every single one of those hours. He found power in that engine that the factory engineers who designed it never imagined. Not by throwing money at expensive components. By understanding how the systems interacted. By seeing the whole picture while everyone else was staring at the individual pieces. And the results spoke for themselves in the most literal way possible. NHRA Pro Stock World Championship. National event wins across his career that placed him firmly in the all-time conversation for the class. Among the first pro stock racers to break into the 9-second elapsed time range. A benchmark that was a seismic event in the sport at the time it happened. When Bill Jenkins posted a 9-second run, people stopped what they were doing. Because people understood what it meant. They understood the level of everything. The engine, the chassis, the tuning, the driving, that had to be right simultaneously for that number to appear on the timing board. But here is the thing about Jenkins that I find more impressive than any of that. He wrote it down. He wrote books, technical articles, detailed, specific, genuinely useful breakdowns of his methods and his thinking about engine building and performance. At a time, and I want you to feel the significance of this, at a time when the standard practice among top-level racers was to protect their technical knowledge the way you protect any competitive advantage. Keep it close. Keep it secret. Don't give anyone any help beating you. Jenkins looked at that calculus and came to a completely different conclusion. He shared everything. And the reason that makes this even more extraordinary, is that Jenkins was confident enough in his ability to execute that he didn't fear the knowledge spreading. He basically believed, I can tell you exactly how I do it, step by step, in writing, and you will still have enormous difficulty replicating my results. Because knowledge is one thing. The feel, the instinct, the years of calibrated experience that tells you in the moment which way to push the tuning and by how much, that doesn't transfer through a book. That was a level of confidence in his own ability that most people will never experience. Not arrogance, certainty, the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who has tested himself against real competition under real conditions and knows, without needing to advertise it, exactly where he stands. Those books became sacred texts in the racing community. Engine builders who never met Jenkins, working in shops across America, built faster and better engines because of what he chose to share. That influence, patient, unglamorous, transmitted through grease-stained pages from one serious builder to another, is a legacy that runs deeper than any championship trophy. Trophies sit on shelves. Knowledge compounds. That's what Bill Jenkins left behind. Compounding knowledge. And it's still paying dividends today. The man behind the myth. Here's where I get real with you. I've been building a case for Bill Jenkins this whole video. And I believe every word of it. But I'm not here to hand you a saint. Saints are boring. What makes a person worth understanding is the full picture, the rough edges included. So yeah, Jenkins was hard to be around sometimes. That's not rumor. That's documented across enough accounts that it's simply true. His standards weren't just high, they were vertical, unclimbable. Applied to everyone around him with the same merciless consistency he applied to himself. Make a careless mistake in his shop? You heard about it. Immediately. Directly. No diplomatic softening. No, great effort though. Just, this is wrong, fix it, don't let it happen again. That's uncomfortable. I won't pretend otherwise. But here's what stopped me cold when I went deeper into the accounts of people who actually worked with him. Not people who had one bad interaction and built a legend around it, but people who were genuinely in his world, day after day, season after season. They didn't resent him. They were grateful. Because working alongside someone who cares that ferociously, who brings that level of knowledge and seriousness to every single day, it raises you. Whether you want it to or not. Your standards climb just from being in the same room. What you think is possible quietly expands. Working with Bill Jenkins made you better at your craft, and the people who experienced that understood the value of it even when it was uncomfortable. And then there's the thing nobody expects when they hear the nickname. The man was funny. Not loud funny. Not performing for the room funny. A dry, flat, perfectly timed deadpan that arrived without warning and disappeared before you'd fully registered it. The kind where he'd say something so quietly devastating and accurate that the room would go silent for 3 full seconds, and then everybody would lose it at once. He wasn't performing warmth. But warmth was there. In its own quiet language. available to people patient enough to learn it. The nickname captured one real layer of a complicated man and presented it as the whole person. That's not biography. That's a caricature. Bill Jenkins deserved the full picture. Most complicated people do. The quiet genius. Why this story matters now. Let me make this personal for a second. Think about someone in your life. A parent, a grandparent, a mentor, a man you worked alongside. Who was that person? You know exactly who I mean. The one who didn't talk about the work. Just did it. The one who showed up first and left last and never mentioned either. The one whose standards were so high it was almost intimidating to stand next to them. The one whose approval meant something real, because it was rare enough to actually be worth something. The one who never quite fit the social flow of wherever they were, because their head was always somewhere else. Always inside the problem. Always 3 steps ahead of the conversation everyone else was having. How did the world treat that person? Be honest. The world probably called them difficult. Antisocial. A little much. Grumpy. Because our culture has never known what to do with people who are fully given over to their craft. People who don't moderate their intensity to make the room more comfortable. We put quotes on social media about passion and commitment and being fully present in your work, and then the moment we actually encounter a living human being who embodies those things, we give them a nickname and keep our distance. That gap, between what we say we admire and what we actually reward in real time, that gap did real damage to how Bill Jenkins is remembered. He was pursuing mastery. Not fame built on mastery. Not a brand constructed around mastery. Just mastery itself, as a thing worth pursuing for its own sake, on its own terms, without an audience. And now we're living in a world where the algorithm doesn't surface results without a content strategy attached. Where a man who worked in silence would simply be invisible. Where grumpy would get fewer followers than someone half as talented who knew how to frame a good post. Jenkins made peace with the trade-off. He decided the opinion of people who didn't understand the work was simply not a relevant data point. But we should feel the loss anyway. Because those people, the quiet ones, the serious ones, the ones who let the work speak, they don't always come along twice. So, was the nickname fair? I've been sitting with that question this whole video. Here's where I land. Understandable? I can trace the exact path from the crossed arms and the flat expression to the moment somebody first said, "Man, that guy is grumpy," and everyone nodded. That path makes complete sense. But fair? Still. Because what that one word reduced, what it compressed into something dismissible, was a form of excellence that is genuinely rare and genuinely hard to sustain across a career. The excellence of a man who decided the work was the point. Not the recognition. Not the persona. Not the brand. The actual work. The solving of real problems. The engineering of machines that did things nobody else's machines could do. And the quiet, private satisfaction of watching that appear on a timing board that doesn't care how charming you are. That's a beautiful way to live. It deserves better than grumpy. It deserves words like serious, like committed, like rare. The books he wrote are still on shelves in engine builders' shops right now, today. The methods he developed became foundations that other people built entire careers on. The championships he won were earned through technical understanding that his competitors frequently couldn't match even when they knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't a difficult man who happened to be a fast racer. He was a brilliant man who happened to exist in a world that didn't have the right vocabulary for what he was. And if you've made it this far, if you've been here through the whole story, I think you recognize something in him. Maybe it's someone you knew. Maybe it's something in yourself. That place where getting it right matters more than being liked for trying. Where the work matters more than the applause. If you have even a little of that in you, you already understood Bill Jenkins better than the nickname ever did. His cars ran 9 seconds flat. And they never needed to explain themselves to anyone. Drop it in the comments. Who was the Bill Jenkins in your life? The quiet one. The serious one. The one who never asked for credit but made everything around them better just by showing up. I want to hear that story. And if you think these kinds of stories deserve to be told, you already know what to do.